She came west with nothing but a promise, and ended up screaming in the dust, bound and bloodied beneath a stranger's whip. But just before the final strike fell, he caught it. A silent man with war in his eyes and kindness in his hands. What followed wasn't just a rescue. It was a rebirth. And what they built together might just change how you see love's survival and what it means to truly belong. Stay with us, because this story will stay with you forever. They say the wind never lies in Montana. It speaks in howls and whispers in the language of things torn loose and stories best left buried. On a late summer afternoon in 1881, the wind came screaming down the canyons of Redstone Range, carrying with it dust-dried blood and the sound of something breaking wide open. The Raven Hollow Ranch was just a speck on the map hard land, harder men. But that day it became the setting for a reckoning, and at the center of it all was a young woman with torn sleeves, bound wrists, and a scream swallowed by the dry air. Elena Bray had believed in better beginnings. 24 years old and too trusting by half, she came west on the promise of honest work. A cooking job, they said. Meals for men working the land. What she found instead was a trap, no wages, no freedom, and when she tried to escape, they caught her like a stray animal. That afternoon, the foreman, Grant Vellum, a man who believed cruelty was the same thing as control, dragged her into the hard-packed yard. Dust swirled. The sun bore down like judgment, and the whip in his hand snapped once, then twice, slicing into her back. Her dress split at the shoulder. Her knees hit dirt. Her voice rose for a moment, cracked, then went silent. "You think someone's coming," he jeered, pulling the whip back for a third strike. "Ain't nobody care what happens to a girl like you. But somebody did. The whip never landed." It froze mid-air, held fast in a gloved hand, one rough with calluses and dirt. The foreman turned, already swearing, but the words died in his throat. Silas Ward stood behind him. The man was a shadow to most. He lived across the ridge past Flathead Lake, where the cottonwoods grew thick and the stars blinked undisturbed. Folks said he'd fought in the war and left part of himself behind on a battlefield called Stones River. What remained was silence, solitude, and the kind of strength that made a man step in when others turned away. He didn't speak. Didn't have to. He yanked the whip from Vellum's hand and let it fall like a snake to the dirt. The world around them held its breath. The ranch hands stilled. Even the horses near the corral turned their ears. Vellum squared his shoulders, puffing up like a man unsure if he should fight or run. "This ain't your business." Silas didn't flinch. He stepped past him, crouched beside Elena. Her face was streaked with dust and blood, but her chin was high. Her lips moved not to beg, but to ask a single word. Why, Silas answered without sound. He cut the rope binding her wrists and lifted her as if she weighed nothing. She sagged against him, not out of trust, but exhaustion. He carried her across the yard, past the stairs, past the silence, and didn't look back. That's the moment the story begins, not with words, but with what wasn't said. They rode double on his black gelding. Elena trembled, wrapped in a worn blanket he pulled from the saddle. She didn't ask where they were going. Her body ached too much. Her spirit more. After nearly an hour's ride, the trees thickened. A narrow path led to a clearing where a small cabin sat nestled near a stream. Cottonwoods lined the banks like sentinels. The roof was weathered, the barn, modest, but the place had a feeling to it. A hush that felt more like safety than silence. Silas dismounted, lifted her down gently, and brought her inside. The cabin smelled of pine and old leather. He set her on a bed layered in quilts. Then, without hesitation, he fetched water-clean cloth and a tin of ointment. He knelt beside her, cleaned the cuts along her back with hands that were calloused but precise. Not once did he look away, Not once did he offer pity. When he was done, he left a piece of bread, a cup of water, and a note written in thick, deliberate letters. "You're safe. No one will find you here. Rest." She held the note in shaking fingers, read it twice, then curled beneath the quilts and slept without dreaming. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods like a hymn, and inside, for the first time in months, Elena Bray didn't feel like something that needed to be hidden or fixed. She felt allowed to be broken, healing, or neither. The next morning, light filtered through the window in soft stripes. Elena sat up slowly, muscles protesting. Her back throbbed, but the pain was clean, no longer cruel. She swung her legs off the bed, bare feet touching warm wood. A fire crackled in the stove. A tin plate beside the hearth held more bread and a sliced apple. She stepped to the door, opened it, and watched. Silas was by the barn sleeves rolled, stacking wood with quiet purpose. He looked up, as if he'd felt her gaze. Their eyes met. He didn't smile, didn't wave, but something passed between them all the same. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it was the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find. And just like that, Elena Bray, once a name shouted in fear, began to become something else entirely. The wind still blew over Redstone Range, but that morning it carried something new, a promise. There are some silences that heal deeper than words ever could. The silence that followed Elena Bray's rescue was not empty, it was full. It filled the cabin like warmth, like fresh bread rising, like the soft breath of something finding its shape again. She awoke the next morning, not with fear, but with the kind of aching that told her she had survived. Her body was sore, but the weight of dread was no longer pressing down on her chest. The fire in the hearth had burned low, but not out. The blanket wrapped around her still carried the faint scent of pine and tobacco. On the small wooden table near the bed, someone had placed a tin cup of warm water, a piece of cornbread, and another note. The same hand, strong careful, had written a single sentence. "You are not alone here." It was not poetry, but it didn't have to be. Elena held the note like it was something sacred. The cabin creaked gently around her, old timber settling into morning stillness. When she stepped out onto the porch, the cold bit at her bare arms, but the sun was climbing. Across the yard, Silas Ward was working. He did not glance up right away. He split wood with a practiced motion, deliberate, measured. When he did meet her eyes, he simply nodded once. That was the first conversation. Elena began moving through her pain with slow determination. She asked to help. He didn't answer but handed her a basket filled with fresh hay for the hen house. That became the rhythm. He didn't speak, she didn't push, but with each quiet task they shared something thawed. There were no questions about her past, no pitying looks, only action. When she slipped carrying a bucket of water, he was beside her in 2 strides, steadying her arm. When she winced while bending over, he disappeared into the barn and returned with a stool for her to sit and shell beans. It wasn't kindness in the way people often give it with noise and flourish. It was a different kind of care, a kind that didn't demand to be seen. One evening, they ate stew by the fire. She sat on a cushion legs tucked beneath her hands, wrapped around a clay bowl. He sat across from her, one knee bent elbow on the hearthstone. She watched the firelight flicker across his face. "I don't think I've ever felt safe like this," she said almost to herself. He looked at her. No surprise in his eyes, just understanding. "You don't talk," she added, "but you listen." Still, he said nothing. Instead, he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded paper. He handed it to her. It was a letter. The words were uneven, the ink faded, throat damaged. Shrapnel. Voice lost. "I do not miss it much. She read it twice, then again. When she looked up, she felt her throat tighten. "You still came when I screamed." His eyes met hers. That was his answer. That night, as she lay on the narrow bed staring up at the low ceiling, Elena let herself cry for the first time in months. Not from fear or pain, but from the simple enormity of being held together, not by chains, but by gentleness. As days passed, her back began to heal. The wounds scabbed her steps grew stronger. She swept the porch, gathered eggs, baked simple bread with what flour remained. She found her hands remembering old movements her mind had forgotten, kneading, braiding, humming. She began to hum again. Silas noticed. He always noticed. He fixed the back latch on the chicken coop after it creaked too long. He added a shelf beside the bed where she could place the cup and her comb. He left a book, a Bible, missing half its cover on the table with a pressed flower inside. One afternoon she found him sketching beside the barn. He quickly closed the notebook, but not before she glimpsed her own profile, head bowed, hair loose. She said nothing. That evening they sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. The cottonwoods whispered like old friends. "I'm not running anymore," she said. He didn't look at her, just nodded once. She shifted, turned toward him. "I know you can't say it, but I feel it. You care." He turned to her then, his face quiet and unreadable, slowly softened. She reached up and touched his jaw. His hand rose to cover hers. Then without a word he leaned forward and kissed her slow, certain, nothing rushed. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining. Not with tears, but with something older, deeper. That night she dreamed not of escape, but of planting things. The next morning, he was gone before dawn. She found him near the stream checking the traps and gathering wood. He handed her a wild apple he'd found still clinging to a gnarled tree. She bit into it, juice running down her chin. And she laughed. The sound startled even her. Silas smiled, small, brief, but it was real. That day she washed her old dress and hung it in the sun. She didn't need it anymore. She wore one of Silas's flannel shirts instead, rolled at the sleeves. It smelled of smoke and cedar. As the wind moved through Redstone Range again, it carried something new, not just a promise, but the first shape of a future. Together. Not all homes are built from lumber and stone. Some are shaped by the quiet weight of shared mornings, the comfort of knowing someone will leave a light burning for you. By late September, the winds over Redstone Range began to shift, and Elena Bray found herself imagining something she hadn't dared to picture in a long time. A life made not of survival, but of belonging. The cabin she shared with Silas had grown warm in more ways than one. She began leaving her shawl on the same hook each evening, folding his shirts beside her own, sweeping the hearth as if the space itself mattered. There was no declaration, no ceremony, but between the lines of silence, something real had rooted. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the sky smear itself orange and pink, Elena turned toward him and spoke softly. The cabin could use another room, just a small one, with windows that face west. Silas didn't hesitate. He simply nodded, then stood, went inside and returned with a length of charcoal and a roll of feed sack paper. He began sketching right there on the porch floor. They spent the next weeks building it together, each board, each nail, a conversation in motion. Elena held beams steady while Silas hammered. He smoothed rough wood while she brushed away sawdust. When her hands blistered, he rubbed salve into her palms with a tenderness that caught in her throat. It wasn't just the room they were shaping. It was the life around it. They began to rise with the sun eat cornbread off tin plates, laugh without noise over crooked measurements and bent nails. Sometimes she caught him watching her not with hunger or pity, but with something quieter, like reverence. She caught herself singing again. She hadn't meant to. The melodies rose from her chest like birds returning after winter. She hummed while boiling water, while brushing dust from the windowsill, while sitting on the porch watching the world stretch wide and gold. Silas listened. Always listened. Then came the day the rider arrived. It was a Sunday. The wind carried the dry scent of early autumn. A man on a piebald horse approached slowly down the path. He was tall, lean, with gray at his temples, and a coat mended at the elbows. Elena stepped out onto the porch floor on her hands. "Is this Silas Ward's place?" the man asked, voice brittle with fatigue. "It is." The man dismounted with a groan and looked past her toward the barn. "Name's Theo Callan. Me and Silas, we served together." Stones River. She barely had time to nod before Silas emerged from the barn. He froze, eyes narrowing not in anger but recognition. The two men didn't speak. They walked toward each other, and Silas gripped Theo's shoulder in both hands. That night, Theo sat at their table eating stew with shaky hands. "My wife passed 2 winters ago," he said. "My boy last spring. I've been drifting ever since. Wasn't sure where else to go." He didn't ask for pity, just a place to sleep. A bit of work, a place to matter. Silas pointed to the loft above the barn. That was all it took. From then on, Theo became part of the rhythm. He chopped wood-repaired fence rails and taught Elena how to carve spoons from willow branches. He whittled a small horse for the mantel and repaired the squeaky door hinge without being asked. He and Silas didn't speak much, but there was ease between them. A knowing. Elena made him tea in the evenings and asked about the war only once. He didn't answer, but later that night he left a bundle of letters on the porch railing tied with twine. She never opened them, but she never threw them away either. They held their wedding beneath the cottonwoods by the stream. There was no preacher, no crowd. Just Elena in a faded dress, Silas in his best shirt, Theo standing to the side with a battered fiddle. Elena spoke her vows aloud, her voice steady and sure. Silas pressed her hand to his heart and kissed her slowly, gently as if anchoring them both to the moment. Later, they shared cornbread and apples on the porch, Theo's music dancing through the twilight. It wasn't about the rings. It wasn't even about the vows. It was about the life they'd already begun to build. After that, the days took on new shape. Elena planted an herb garden, her skirts muddy, her hands brown from soil. She pressed lavender into jars, boiled salves from pine resin. Silas built a cradle, his hands steady even as his eyes betrayed something close to awe. In the evening, she would catch him tracing the edges of the wood as if memorizing the future. Theo strung a new clothesline, wrote short stories in a leather-bound book, and carved initials into the barn's back post, E was S plus T. He seemed lighter with each passing day, his laugh more certain, his steps less guarded. One evening, as they sat watching the stars blink on, Elena leaned against Silas's shoulder and whispered, "This is more than I ever thought I'd have." He tapped her hand once, then twice. So did I. And as the first frost dusted the porch railings, Elena found herself dreaming again. Not of escape, not even of what was lost, but of what could still be planted, and what in time might grow. In the morning, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, stepped outside, and began clearing the ground for a row of wildflowers, because not all seeds are meant to feed. Some are meant to remind you where you've come from, and where at long last you belong. The first snow of winter came like a whispered warning. It arrived in silence, cloaking the Redstone Range, in a soft white that muffled sound and memory alike. It didn't fall in flurries or flutters, but in steady, relentless sheets, as if the sky had decided to bury all that had come before. Elena Bray stood at the window wrapped in her wool shawl, watching the snow gather on the porch rail. The sky outside was the color of ash, and the wind etched frost across the glass like it had something to say. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth, firewood popping in the hearth, the scent of cornbread rising from the stove. But Elena's hands were pressed to her belly, her fingers trembling slightly. She hadn't told Silas yet. She had felt the change in her body before the leaves turned, but waited unsure whether the new life inside her was real, or if it too might vanish like so many of her old dreams. But as the days grew shorter, and her dresses tightened, and her breath caught at the slightest smell of smoke or stew, there was no denying it any longer. She was carrying something that belonged to both of them. Silas had been spending his mornings repairing fence rails, his afternoons preparing the shed for the animals, and his evenings beside the fire with a carving knife in hand. He hadn't said anything. He never did. But Elena caught the glances, the way his hand lingered at her lower back, the extra quilt he'd added to the bed. He knew. Of course he knew. One night, as wind howled through the pines and sleet struck the roof like fingers tapping out a warning, she turned to him and said softly, "I think it'll be a girl." He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He set down the carving, crossed the room, and pulled her into his arms, his cheek pressed to her temple, his hand resting protectively on her back. They stood like that for a long time, the only sound the crackle of fire and the occasional whistle of the wind curling down the chimney. The weeks that followed were slow and sacred. Snow piled high against the barn doors, and the creek froze into stillness. Inside, life moved gently. Theo took to writing by lamplight, his letters growing longer, his pen strokes steadier. He and Elena spent quiet afternoons mending socks and talking about what it meant to start over at any age. She shared old stories from her childhood, and he told her about his late wife's laughter about the son he still dreamt of at night. Silas built a second chair identical to the first so they could sit side by side at the fire. He carved a cradle in the evening, shaping each piece with reverence. He sanded it, smooth-lined it with lamb's wool, and tucked it in the corner by the stove. Elena found herself singing lullabies under her breath, old tunes she hadn't thought of in years. She began sewing a small quilt from scraps of cloth, each square stitched with a bit of memory. Then came the night. It was February. A storm had rolled in, fast turning the sky to slate. Snow fell so thick they couldn't see the edge of the pasture. Elena clutched the windowsill pane, rolling through her in waves. Silas gathered towels. Boiled water kept the fire burning high. Theo stood guard outside the door, pacing in the snow, muttering prayers into the wind. Hours passed. Elena gripped the bed frame until her knuckles went white. Her cries were not loud, but they were fierce. She was determined not to break. Not now. Not when they had come this far. She thought of her mother gone too soon. She thought of the night Silas pulled her from the dirt and carried her across a line she hadn't known existed. She bore down with everything she had. Just before dawn, the child arrived. A girl red-faced and furious with lungs that filled the room. Elena wept as she held the tiny bundle to her chest. Silas knelt beside her, his eyes wet, his hand covering theirs. The fire crackled, and outside the storm slowed to a hush. "She's here," Elena whispered. They named her June, after the first month Elena had felt safe again. In the days that followed, the cabin became a sanctuary. June slept nestled in the cradle Silas had made. Theo sang to her when Elena needed to sleep. Silas carved a rattle from ash wood and smoothed it until it shone. Elena rocked her daughter while the wind moaned outside, her voice steady now, her heart full. One afternoon, Elena stood in the doorway, June wrapped snug in her arms. Silas was in the yard splitting wood. He looked up, saw her, and his face softened. She smiled, and he walked toward her without a word, wrapping his arms around both of them. They stayed like that, the three of them wrapped in stillness and warmth. A family made not by chance but by choice, by every hard step and every quiet act of care that had brought them to this moment. One evening, as the fire cast dancing shadows on the wall, Elena looked at Silas and whispered, "Did you ever think we'd get to this?" He reached across the table, took her hand and tapped twice. "We built it." Spring still felt far away. The snow showed no signs of retreat, but something had changed. The silence no longer held fear. The shadows no longer startled her. And for the first time in her life, Elena Bray didn't just feel safe. She felt whole, and the wind outside carried only peace. By the time the snow began to melt, the land had already decided to remember them. Spring seeped into the Redstone Range, slowly, hesitantly, as though the mountains themselves needed time to be sure the cold had truly gone. The creek cracked its ice first, whispering again over stones. Then the cottonwoods along the valley floor began to bud their silver branches, waking like old bones, stretching. Inside the cabin, light danced off polished wood, and the smell of coffee mixed with the sweet scent of lavender oil. June lay curled in her cradle, her tiny chest rising and falling in the rhythm of dreamless sleep. Elena sat beside the fire, her journal open in her lap pen, hovering above the page. She didn't write at first, just listened. To the creak of Silas's boots outside, to the sound of Theo's saw somewhere near the barn, to the breath of a house that had become a home, not by luck or design, but by love worn into every corner. Then she wrote 2 words, "We stayed." The thought of leaving had not entered her mind since June's birth. The ache to wander, to escape, to be anywhere but where she was, that ache had faded, replaced by something quieter and stronger, a knowing. Silas had started planting by mid-April, corn beans, tomatoes. He turned the soil with a rhythm that steadied Elena just to watch. She joined him when she could, with June in a sling against her chest. Theo built a frame for climbing squash and began sketching plans for a small smokehouse they could finish before fall. One afternoon, a young couple came up the ridge. Their horse was thin, their eyes sunken with miles and hunger. Elena opened the door before they could knock. She didn't ask where they were from. She only said, "You're safe now." They stayed in the guest room that had once been Silas's drawing space. Within days, Theo was showing the man how to mend the chicken wire. Elena taught the woman to make soap from wood ash and fat. June learned the baby's name, Lily, and the valley held them too. By summer, a second cradle sat by the hearth. In July, Silas built a bench beneath the cottonwoods. They would sit there in the evening, sometimes in silence, sometimes in memory. Elena would read aloud from the Bible they had found years ago beneath the floorboards. The pages were worn thin, the spine frayed, but the words still held. Theo's letters grew into a stack tied with twine. He never said to whom he wrote, but he smiled more now, and sometimes sang under his breath while chopping wood. He carved a small cross for the cottonwood grove, and told Elena he planned to plant wildflowers there in the fall. In August, Elena realized her skirts no longer fit the same. She didn't say anything at first, just moved a bit slower, smiled a bit longer. When she finally told Silas, he rested his hand over hers and tapped it 3 times. She wept into his chest, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of joy. They called the land their own, though no paper had ever been signed. It didn't matter. It knew them. It remembered the footsteps, the blood and ash, the lullabies sung to sleeping children. Silas carved the name Bray Ward into the barn beam, not for pride, for permanence. The baby came in February during another snowstorm. This time, Elena did not cry out. She breathed through it, her hands in Silas's Theo, waiting just outside. It was a boy. They named him Asa for strength. He looked like Silas, quiet and observing even as an infant. They built on again that spring. a room for the children, a sunroom for books and drying herbs. Theo moved into a small cottage west of the barn. He painted its door blue and placed a rocking chair beneath the window. One Sunday, Elena gathered everyone, Silas, Theo, the young couple, the children, and they planted 3 trees near the stream. One for what was, one for what is, and one for what could still come. The soil was soft from rain. June placed the first seed with her tiny fingers. Asa held tight to his father's pant leg, eyes wide at the ceremony he didn't yet understand. Years passed. The land grew, so did the family. Letters came and went, so did seasons. Theo passed in his sleep one fall, his hands folded over his chest, a letter to his son unfinished beside him. They buried him beneath the cross he'd made, the wildflowers blooming as promised. Elena placed his fiddle beside the grave, and Silas carved a stone with just his first name, no dates. Just the word friend. June learned to ride. Asa learned to carve. Silas taught both how to plant by the moon, how to listen to wind and creek. Elena taught them how to bake, how to forgive, and how to begin again when everything feels lost. The children flourished not because the world was easy, but because they had been taught to make space for others inside it. One winter, the valley was so still it felt like time had forgotten it. Elena woke one morning and sat on the porch for hours. Snow clung to the fence posts. Smoke rose straight from the chimney. Silas brought her coffee, placed a blanket across her lap, and sat beside her without asking why. Later that year, June turned 10. They held a picnic beneath the trees she helped plant. Asa played a song on a whistle he'd made. The young couple, now no longer so young, brought a second baby, swaddled in soft blue. Laughter filled the fields. One evening, Elena sat beside Silas on the bench beneath the cottonwoods. The sun sank low, painting the hills gold. June's laughter carried across the pasture. Asa followed behind, holding a jar of fireflies. Elena turned to Silas, rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you think they'll remember us?" she asked. Silas pressed her hand to his heart. "They will," she said, "because we gave them more than land. We gave them a way to live." He nodded, and together they watched the stars come out one by one. The wind carried their names, and the land listened. Elena Bray's journey began with a scream in the dust beneath a whip in a place that mistook labor for possession. But it didn't end there. Through pain and grit, through silence and slow-blooming trust, she carved a new path across the unforgiving terrain of the Redstone Range. What started as a desperate escape became something much deeper, the building of a life anchored in dignity and belonging in the promise of tomorrow. Silas Ward, a man of few words, taught us that love need not always be spoken. In every nail driven in every blanket tucked around a shoulder and every seed planted, his hands told stories no voice ever could. He carried his scars from war and loss, but instead of closing his heart, he opened his home. In his quiet, he created space for others to heal. Theo, the old soldier with a weathered past, came not seeking charity but purpose. In the sawdust of the barn and the music of his fiddle, he left behind a legacy that didn't rely on blood, but on chosen family. The young couple, weary from the road, found safety not in walls, but in welcome. And the children, June and Asa, grew up not only learning how to work the land, but how to love it, how to carry a name with pride and humility. This was never just a love story. It was a survival story, a redemption story. It was a map drawn in calloused hands and late-night whispers. It was lavender oil and snowstorms, piano keys, and stitched quilts. It was laughter between chores and tears shared without shame. It was the story of what happens when people say enough to pain and yes to each other. Elena's strength was not in her endurance alone, but in her transformation. She arrived at the edge of death and chose day by day not just to live, but to love again. Her voice, once lost to the dust of broken mesa, now filled a valley where children laughed and trees bloomed. She planted herself not in bitterness, but in hope. And that hope grew. The land did not just remember, it responded. The hills bore witness to their growth, the trees shielded their secrets. The stream carried their dreams downstream like polished stones. What they built together, a home, a family, a sanctuary, wasn't forged in wealth or prestige. It was made from ordinary miracles, patience, kindness, and the decision to stay. And so, what do we carry from their story? We carry the truth that healing takes time, but it is possible. That silence can speak volumes when it is filled with care. That home is not a place you find, it's one you make. That every act of tenderness, no matter how small, shapes the legacy we leave. That redemption isn't a sudden revelation, it's a series of small, consistent choices made with love. In a world that moves too fast and forgets too easily, where River Remembers calls us to pause, to build instead of run, to listen instead of shout, to offer shelter even when we ourselves are still healing, to love without conditions, to be the ones who stay, who reach back for others, who build bridges with their bare hands. It reminds us that there is a kind of strength that doesn't shout, that there is wisdom in weathered hands and stories etched into old wood, that sometimes the greatest bravery is not found in battle, but in making a life worth living after the wounds. What Elena and Silas built wasn't perfect, but it was honest, it was earned, and it was enough. More than enough. It was the kind of life that echoes beyond its years. As we reflect on their journey, may we be reminded that peace doesn't arrive on horseback. It's woven one thread at a time through choices we make daily, through the courage to forgive, the humility to start over, and the grace to let others in. The journey from survival to purpose isn't swift, but it is sacred. So if this story touched something in you, hold it close. Let it guide you when the days feel long and your spirit feels small. Let it be the warm cup of coffee in a storm, the soft hum in the dark, the quiet nudge to try again. And if you're ever unsure of your worth, remember Elena, who once had nothing and became the heart of something enduring. And if you have ever wondered whether your own past is too broken to build upon, let this be your answer: it is not. The river remembers not just where you've been, but who you've become. Thank you for spending this time with us in the Redstone Range, for walking the hills, for sitting by the fire, for bearing witness to a story of ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. If you believe in stories that heal, inspire, and bring us closer to what matters most, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us keep sharing tales like this one's that remind us who we are and who we still might become. Hit that subscribe button, share this story with someone you care about, and stay tuned. Because in the next story, the river still remembers, and the journey is just beginning.